There is a word that quietly gets in the way of more progress than almost any obstacle people can name. It is not a loud word, and it does not sound dangerous. In fact, when people say it, they usually believe they are being perfectly reasonable. The word is later, and it often hides a very comfortable kind of self-deception. When someone says they will not do something, the decision is at least honest. It may not be the best choice, but it is clear. When someone says they will do something later, the situation becomes very different. The intention stays alive in their mind, but the action needed to turn that intention into reality quietly gets pushed out of the present moment. That small shift is where the deception begins. By placing the effort somewhere in the future, people avoid the discomfort of saying no to the goal, while also avoiding the responsibility of acting today. The mind feels relieved because the task has been acknowledged, even though nothing in the real world has actually changed. It becomes a clever arrangement the mind makes with itself. Someone keeps the image of being a person who plans to improve, plans to work, and plans to grow. Yet the effort required for that improvement is always scheduled for a day that has not arrived yet. The goal survives in theory, while progress quietly disappears in practice. Most people do not notice this happening because the word later sounds responsible. It suggests that the task will eventually be done. It implies that the opportunity has not been rejected. It has simply been postponed. Unfortunately, the calendar does not treat intentions and actions the same way. The calendar only records what is actually done. It does not reward plans that are stored for another time. If someone plans to read a book later, the knowledge does not appear today. If someone intends to develop a skill later, the ability does not suddenly show up this week. The distance between intention and action stays exactly where it was. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. People build up a long list of good ideas, strong plans, and meaningful ambitions. Each one carries the promise that it will eventually be addressed. Yet because each one has been pushed into the future, the present moment becomes strangely empty of real progress. Many people spend years living inside this pattern without fully realizing it. They believe they are moving toward their goals because they think about them often. They may even talk about them regularly. The plans sound good, the intentions sound sincere, and the future always seems like it will provide the right moment to begin. But the future has a habit of behaving in a very predictable way. Whenever it finally arrives, it quietly changes its name to today. And when that moment appears, the same comfortable word is often waiting again. The plan is still good. The intention is still sincere, but the action is scheduled for later. This cycle allows people to postpone responsibility indefinitely without ever feeling like they have truly abandoned their ambitions. The dream stays alive in conversation, yet the discipline needed to build that dream rarely enters the present moment. The result is a life filled with admirable intentions, but very little measurable movement. If you look closely at people who consistently move forward, you will notice something different about how they treat this word. They do not give later the authority to control their progress. They understand that postponement may feel harmless, but it slowly shifts control of a life away from deliberate action and toward passive waiting. The difference between people who move forward and those who remain stuck is often not intelligence, talent, or opportunity. More often, the difference comes down to something much simpler. One group acts while the opportunity is present, and the other group politely schedules their effort for another day. Once someone begins recognizing how easily the word later can hide avoidance, they start seeing its influence in many parts of life. Plans that should have started months ago remain untouched. Ideas that could have grown into meaningful achievements remain stored as thoughts instead of becoming reality. The problem was never a lack of ability or a shortage of ideas. The problem was simply that the work needed to bring those ideas into existence kept being introduced to a very persuasive word. That word sounded harmless each time it was spoken, yet it quietly postponed progress again and again. Understanding this is not meant to create guilt or frustration. It is meant to create awareness. Once someone becomes aware of the comfortable lie hidden inside the word later, they gain the ability to challenge it. And the moment the challenge begins, the pattern that has delayed so much progress can finally start to lose its influence. Whenever someone postpones an important decision, the delay rarely seems to carry any serious consequence. In the moment, nothing dramatic appears to happen. The world keeps moving forward, the day unfolds normally, and life looks mostly unchanged. Because the effects are not immediately visible, the cost of postponement often goes unnoticed. Yet something very real begins to build beneath the surface the moment progress is delayed. The cost is not always measured in money, and it does not always appear clearly on a calendar. Instead, it shows up through something economists call opportunity cost, which simply means the value of what could have happened but did not. When someone delays starting a new skill, the time that could have been used to develop that ability quietly disappears. A year later, another person who began earlier may already have built experience, made mistakes, corrected those mistakes, and become more capable. The difference between them was not intelligence or talent, but simply the decision about when to start. The same principle applies to relationships. Friendships, partnerships, and professional connections grow through attention and shared experiences. When someone delays reaching out, delays showing appreciation, or delays strengthening those connections, time passes without that growth taking place. Opportunities for deeper relationships may quietly disappear before someone realizes what was lost. Progress in life rarely happens through one dramatic leap. More often it happens through gradual accumulation. Small actions repeated over long periods create abilities, reputations, and achievements that look impressive only because of how long they have been developing. When the beginning of that process is delayed, the entire chain of progress moves further into the future. Consider someone who plans to improve their health. They may intend to start exercising, improving their diet, or building stronger discipline. If they postpone the beginning by a year, they do not just lose 12 months of effort. They also lose the results that those 12 months of effort would have produced. By the time that year passes, someone who began earlier may have already improved their energy, strength, and confidence. The person who delayed the effort is now standing at the same starting line they faced 12 months earlier. The difference between them is measured in accumulated action, not in intention. What makes this cost difficult to notice is that it rarely creates immediate discomfort. When someone delays starting a project, the day still feels normal. When they postpone learning a new ability, life continues without interruption. Because the penalty is not immediate, the decision to wait feels harmless. However, time follows very specific rules. It keeps moving forward, whether progress is happening or not. When someone chooses not to begin, the clock does not pause out of fairness. The days keep passing, and those days represent opportunities that will never appear again in exactly the same form. A person who waits for the perfect moment may eventually realize that perfection was never required. Many opportunities only needed a simple beginning. Yet while someone was waiting for ideal conditions, another person may have started with imperfect circumstances and improved gradually through experience. This is one of the quiet truths about progress that many people overlook. The difference between where someone is and where they could be is often measured in years of action that never happened. Those years are not taken away by bad luck or outside forces. They are often given up through small decisions to begin later instead of sooner. It is important to understand that this cost rarely appears in a dramatic way. Life does not pause and announce that a valuable opportunity has been lost. Instead, the opportunity quietly slips into the past and is replaced by new circumstances that may not carry the same potential. Over long periods of time, these small delays begin forming a pattern. Months become years, and years become entire seasons of life. When someone finally looks back, they may realize that many of the goals they once imagined would have been well within reach if the process had simply started earlier. This realization is not meant to discourage anyone. In fact, it can be extremely empowering. Once someone understands that the cost of delay comes from lost time rather than a lack of ability, the solution becomes surprisingly simple. The answer is not extraordinary talent or sudden inspiration. The answer is simply beginning while the opportunity still exists. Every day that action replaces delay is a day when the silent cost stops growing. Progress may begin slowly, but the moment someone starts moving forward, time begins working in their favor, instead of quietly working against them. When someone postpones action once or twice, it may not seem very important. Life sometimes requires delay, and there are situations when waiting is perfectly reasonable. However, something very different begins to happen when postponement becomes a regular response instead of an occasional choice. The human mind is extremely adaptable. Any behavior that is repeated often enough eventually becomes familiar, and whatever becomes familiar begins to feel natural. This means even a small habit, if practiced consistently, can quietly reshape how someone approaches responsibility. When people repeatedly answer opportunity with the word later, the mind begins learning a pattern. Instead of connecting important tasks with immediate effort, it begins connecting them with delay. The moment a challenge appears, the mind instinctively looks for a way to move the effort further down the road. At first, this response may seem harmless. The person still plans to complete the task, and the intention remains in their mind. Yet the repeated act of postponement slowly trains the mind to expect relief whenever action is delayed. That relief becomes a powerful form of reinforcement. Every time responsibility is moved into the future, the person feels a small sense of comfort. The pressure disappears for the moment, and the day becomes easier to manage. Because the mind naturally prefers comfort over effort, it begins repeating the behavior that produces that relief. Over time, this process changes what started as a simple scheduling choice into something much deeper. The word later stops being occasional and starts becoming a default reaction. Whenever effort is required, the mind automatically begins negotiating with the future. This is where postponement becomes more than just a habit of action. It becomes a habit of thinking. Instead of asking how something can be done today, the mind begins asking how it might be delayed, without completely giving up the intention. The focus moves from execution to negotiation. Someone may still describe themselves as a person who wants to improve. They may sincerely believe they are committed to their goals, yet their daily pattern often tells a different story. The moment responsibility appears, the mind quietly reaches for the familiar response it has practiced many times before. Once this pattern becomes established, something interesting begins to happen. Even relatively small tasks begin feeling heavier than they actually are. Because the mind has trained itself to delay effort, The idea of starting immediately begins to feel uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Imagine a door that has not been opened in years. The hinges become stiff, and even a small push requires more effort than expected. The same thing can happen to someone's willingness to act. When action has been postponed again and again, beginning feels strangely difficult. The difficulty does not come from the size of the task. It comes from the fact that the mind has been conditioned to expect postponement. Immediate effort starts to feel like an interruption to the comfortable rhythm that delay has created. This is why some people find themselves surrounded by unfinished plans and postponed ambitions. The ideas themselves may be worthwhile, and they may genuinely care about them. Yet the habit of delay has become so deeply rooted in their thinking that action rarely happens at the moment when it would matter most. Over time, this pattern can start shaping the direction of an entire life. Opportunities appear, but the person hesitates. Responsibilities show up, but the response is postponed. Progress remains theoretically possible, yet it never quite becomes part of the daily routine. It is important to understand that this pattern does not develop because someone lacks intelligence or ability. It develops because the mind learns through repetition. Whatever behavior is practiced often becomes easier to repeat, and whatever is avoided repeatedly becomes harder to begin. Fortunately, the same principle works in the opposite direction as well. If repeated delay can train the mind to postpone action, repeated action can train the mind to respond differently. The pattern that once favored comfort can gradually be replaced by one that favors movement. But before that change can happen, someone first has to recognize the habit for what it really is. The word later may sound harmless when it is spoken, but when it becomes a regular response, it quietly changes the way the mind approaches responsibility. Once it turns into a habit of thinking, it begins influencing far more decisions than most people ever realize. There's an interesting difference between people who keep moving forward in life and those who seem to stay in the same place year after year. The difference is rarely found in dramatic bursts of effort or extraordinary moments of inspiration. More often, it shows up in something much quieter: the willingness to begin while the opportunity is still there. Many people assume progress requires the perfect moment. They believe conditions need to be ideal, their confidence must be high, and every detail needs to be carefully arranged before they can take the first step. Because those conditions rarely come together all at once, the beginning of progress quietly gets postponed again and again. People who consistently move forward tend to approach this very differently. They understand that waiting for perfect conditions usually means waiting forever. Instead of demanding certainty before they start, they allow action itself to create clarity. The moment someone begins doing something, even in a small way, the process of improvement starts immediately. Skills begin developing through experience instead of theory. Problems that once seemed confusing start revealing their solutions through practice. Confidence grows not from thinking about action, but from actually taking part in it. This is why action creates a compounding effect that many people underestimate. One step taken today may not look impressive by itself, but that step places someone on a path where the next step becomes easier, and the step after that starts producing visible results. Think about someone who decides to improve a specific ability. The first attempt may feel awkward and uncertain. By the 10th attempt, several lessons have already been learned. By the 100th attempt, those lessons have turned into real skill. What other people sometimes describe as natural talent is often nothing more than accumulated experience. The person who began earlier has simply been collecting improvements for a longer period of time. While others were waiting for the perfect moment, this person was quietly gathering the benefits of repeated action. This compounding effect does not apply only to skills. It also shows up in reputation, relationships, and personal confidence. Every time someone follows a decision with immediate action, they reinforce an important message to themselves. They are a person who follows through. That identity slowly becomes stronger through repetition. Every completed task builds a small amount of trust between someone and their own word. When people repeatedly prove to themselves that they act when they decide to act, their confidence begins resting on evidence instead of hope. Now compare that with someone who consistently postpones action. Over time, their confidence begins weakening because their decisions rarely turn into execution. The mind quietly learns that intentions may not lead to results, and that uncertainty slowly weakens the belief that progress is truly possible. The remarkable thing is that the difference between these two paths rarely begins with a dramatic turning point. It usually begins with something much simpler. One person chooses to act while the opportunity is present, and another person chooses to wait until conditions feel easier. Those small decisions add up in the same way interest grows in a bank account. At first, the difference is almost invisible. Both people may appear to be standing at the same starting point, but as weeks turn into months and months turn into years, the distance between them becomes more and more noticeable. The person who acted immediately has gathered experience, developed ability, and strengthened confidence through repeated effort. The person who waited has gathered plans, intentions, and ideas that still exist, mostly in theory. The difference between them is measured in accumulated action. What makes this idea encouraging is that it does not depend on extraordinary ability. It depends only on the decision to begin before everything feels perfect. The person who consistently takes small steps today places themselves on a path where progress begins compounding almost immediately. Over time, those small beginnings grow into results that appear significant. Yet those results were never created by one dramatic effort. They were created through a simple discipline, practiced again and again. The discipline of acting while the opportunity is present instead of postponing the beginning for another day. If someone truly wants to remove the cost of postponement from their life, the solution will not be found in occasional bursts of motivation. Motivation can be helpful, but it is unreliable. Some days it appears naturally, and other days it disappears without warning. A life that depends on motivation will always move forward in uneven bursts, followed by long periods of hesitation. The real solution is something far more stable. It is the decision to establish a personal standard. A standard does not wait for enthusiasm, and it does not bargain with convenience. A standard simply defines how someone intends to respond when responsibility appears. Many people treat important actions like optional negotiations with themselves. They ask whether they feel ready, whether conditions are comfortable, or whether the timing seems right. When those conditions are not ideal, the task quietly gets moved into the familiar category of later. Someone who lives according to a standard approaches this very differently. Instead of asking whether something should eventually be done, they decide that certain responsibilities are handled promptly. The decision has already been made in advance, which removes the debate every time effort is required. This change may look small on the surface, but it produces a powerful shift in behavior. When the mind stops negotiating with delay, action begins to follow decisions much faster. The energy that was once spent debating whether to start can now be used for actually doing the work. Standards also create consistency, and consistency is one of the strongest forces behind meaningful progress. When someone repeatedly acts according to a clear principle, their behavior becomes predictable in the best possible way. Important tasks are handled sooner instead of later, and opportunities are addressed while they still exist. Over time, this pattern begins shaping how someone sees themselves. A person begins recognizing themselves as someone who handles responsibilities directly instead of postponing them. That self-image becomes stronger because every completed action confirms the standard they have chosen to follow. Other people begin noticing this pattern as well. People who consistently act on their decisions develop a reputation for reliability and discipline. Opportunities often move toward those who show that they move from decision to execution without unnecessary delay. This reputation does not appear instantly. It grows slowly through repeated demonstrations of the same principle. When someone says they will do something and then quickly follows through, trust increases. When that pattern continues over long periods of time, the person becomes known for a quality that is becoming increasingly rare. One interesting part of this change is how quickly it can shift the direction of a life. Someone may spend years postponing important efforts, yet the moment they replace delay with a standard of prompt action, the entire rhythm of their days begins to change. Tasks that once lingered for weeks begin getting completed quickly. Projects that once existed only as ideas begin taking real form. Progress that once seemed distant starts appearing in measurable ways, because the person is no longer negotiating with the word later. This does not mean life suddenly becomes easy. Important work still requires discipline, patience, and persistence. But the energy that was once lost to postponement is now available for productive effort. Instead of waiting for the future to create better conditions, someone begins shaping those conditions through consistent action. There's often a specific moment when someone realizes that the habit of delay no longer controls their behavior. It happens when they encounter a responsibility and respond immediately instead of automatically pushing it into the future. In that moment, a quiet but powerful shift has taken place. The person has stopped negotiating with postponement and started living by a principle. That principle may sound simple, yet its effect is enormous. Important actions are no longer scheduled for a distant day that may never arrive. They are handled while the opportunity to act still exists. When someone lives according to that standard, progress begins speeding up in ways that once seemed difficult to imagine. The reason is not complicated. They have simply removed one of the most expensive words from their decision-making process. Once later loses its power, the path forward becomes surprisingly clear. Decisions lead to action. Action produces results, and those results gradually change the direction of a life.